All right, so welcome everybody to this remote interview. My name is Lisette, and I'm interviewing people and companies doing great things remotely. And today on the line, after a 6-year hiatus from our last interview in September 2007, I have Peter Smit. Peter, you are in Toronto. You're the founder of Collabogence, which is a tool that measures collaborative performance before and after a change, we can say, but it measured as any time. But I think the most useful time is before and after a change. So you can measure, like, did this change have any sort of effect? We talked back in 2017 about this, but now we've had the pandemic, and you've now measured 50,000 more people and over 1 billion interactions. So we have got data. We have now got a lot more data to talk about, which is why I wanted to have you back on the podcast. So, Peter, let's start with the first question, which is, what does your virtual office look like now, 6 years later? And then I'll tell you what you said 6 years ago. What does your virtual office look like?
The virtual office, I'm still in the same location, except my desk is populated differently. So next to my laptop, I now have 2 additional screens. And in part because I also teach a course at the University of Toronto, which is now titled Remote Work, Technology, and Collaboration. I spent 2 years during COVID doing all that online. And from that perspective, I set up my desk so that I could have the video feeds of all the students on one screen, the content I was sharing on another screen, and the screen with the camera above it had the participant list and the chat box. So I could see what was going on if the students were talking. My students are chronic bad users of cameras. They never turn it on. So I kind of mandated, if you had something to say, you can't put it in the chat box. You have to turn your camera on and raise your hand, and then you can talk. So that changed from that perspective. But if I go back to a little bit before when we last spoke, I was really with a more of a concept idea. And in that phase of the 2 years before COVID, we actually did our first work. So the measurement of 50,000 people and over a billion interactions was actually based on all data pre-COVID. And during COVID, companies weren't making decisions. Companies generally weren't really interested. They were doing surveys and getting more of self-reported data. And everybody said, we're being productive and effective working from home. And everybody was patting each other on the back in terms of how great that was. And profits didn't drop out. The bottom didn't fall out of that. So people were okay for a while. But if we go back a little bit to before COVID, there was an organization that we worked with that was designing new space. So they were going from from assigned desk environments to activity-based workspace. And their hypothesis was, we want to get groups together, sharing space that have a reason to collaborate. And so they acknowledged, and they said, if we put the wrong people in the same space together, nothing will happen. So it can be designed to be hugely collaborative, but nothing will happen from that perspective. And I've come across organizations that basically said, our strategy in the workplace strategy world, it's called adjacencies. So their strategy for adjacency was, if there's a space with 100 seats and you've got a group of 30 and a group of 70, you put them in there together, irrespective of whether or not they have any business reason to be sharing the space with each other. So in any case, they were busy creating these spaces, and initially they wanted to do it from the perspective of individuals. So their goal was for people in the same space to have 50% of their primary business partners, as they called them, in the same space with each other. So they would talk to each other. When we had to show them, demonstrate that we could do that, and we did with data from another organization. And we went back to them and they said, well, the rules have changed a little bit. And so this is a financial services institution. And the pushback was from management was, no, groups that report to an individual need to be all in the same space together, so they can be sharing it with other people. And if you have individuals that work primarily with people in other departments and other areas, they still had to sit with their team. So it was more of a traditional command and control environment. So they gave us the population, all the data of the people, and they had them divided into 250 groups. So we made a giant matrix in which we measured the strength of the relationship between all the groups. So you could look at one group versus another group, and you could see how strong a relationship that was. And so we then started looking for clusters of groups that all had interrelationships. And we said that would be this ideal group to put in a space. So we did that, and they moved in, and then at least 100 days later, we got data on the same groups again. And we could start looking to see what the actual impact was of sharing the space. And what kind of blew our mind was that we had groups, so populations of 500 people, that had increases of collaborative performance of over 35%. So this is disregard all communication with people outside that group of 500, just by sheer fact of design and the fact that they were sharing proximity, we saw massive increases. And so this is where our hypothesis is, because shortly thereafter COVID came, and our hypothesis is still that when they went home to work from home during COVID, that 35% and some more walked out the door. And there was a study done by Microsoft, and I believe it was published in the beginning of 2021, where it was done on 60,000 of their people. And what they were saying is that group strength diminished some, but the strength that lost even more was the team's relationship with other teams. So cross-functional collaboration really lost the most. So with that, we kind of sat on our hands during COVID, and now we're actually releasing a research piece where we're recruiting 10 to 20 companies to give us identical data sets so we can roll them up. And the first data set is actually January 1st through May 30th, 2020, which in North American environment on May 12th March 12th somewhere, is everybody was sent home. So we would actually have first part of the year, which would allow us to establish a pre-COVID baseline. Then we get an early COVID environment. And then the second data set that we're looking for is the second half of 2022, which gives us, if we split that in half around September, it gives us a late COVID baseline and then early return to office. And one of the interesting things that we really want to look at is also what happened during COVID. So which organizations or which departments and groups actually learned to be better remote collaborators and which didn't. And there's going to be a big chunk that didn't change at all. They went down and they stayed there, and some actually got better at remote work. Then the early return to office, and this is again our hypothesis that we want to test with the research, is that when everybody has the opportunity for maximum flexibility and they're assigned to come back to the office 2 or 3 days a week and they pick them, it adds no value to the organization. They might as well stay at home as far as I'm concerned, because the likelihood of them being at the office at the same time as the people that they really need to work with and to reestablish those connections is random. That's totally up to hazard. And that's why and I've mentioned this to you before, is we're looking at what could a structured hybrid look like. So the idea of the research is that we would actually publish this, and we would make it, since I also teach at the University of Toronto, we'll make it a scholarly journal article that gets peer reviewed, so nobody can question the integrity of the data and the process and the methodology that we're doing, but really to help people understand. They may feel they're being productive and effective working from home, but they need to understand the collaborative impact on the organization, which is they all have a vested interests based on bonuses and profit sharing and these types of things, that maybe the hope is that people would then actually understand why there needs to be some sort of a structure to the hybrid. And we can talk about that in a few minutes if you like.
For sure. Well, I have a question, which is, you said that when you got 50% of primary business partners together in the same space, and you were looking at the strength of their relationships, if it was random people, there wasn't that much increase in collaboration.
No.
If it was non-random people, there was a 35% increase in the collaboration. So if you've non-randomly put these people together, and then when COVID hit, that 35% went away. So there was a decrease in productivity when people went remote.
So this is always, people ask me, do you measure productivity? No, we don't.
You
And
measure
in the knowledge,
collaboration,
in
right?
in the knowledge management world, or in the knowledge worker world, it's very difficult to manage to measure productivity from that perspective. So my comment is, and everybody works differently, and certain roles require more collaboration than other roles, and we recognize that. So what we do is we actually look at the collaborative performance, which is a function of the strength of their networks, which has to do with the strength of their relationships with other people. And it's not just based on volume, it's based on reciprocity, it's the smoothness of the data line, a number of different factors that we bring into that. And that really sets it. So we talk about measuring a change in collaborative performance. So we've had discussions with organizations about, for instance, saying in one of the banks, there's a first line manager training session. And one of the goals is to help them think. They're getting their first managerial responsibility to think beyond the group that they normally work with. They have to build bridges to other groups, that we would actually measure them before and after to see whether or not they actually start changing the dynamic of their network. So when you look at a change like going home, starting to work from home, then you would be looking at a drop, and we see the drop in collaborative performance, which is not necessarily equal to a change in productivity, but if there's anything that's a proxy for measuring a change in productivity, it would be that.
Right, but I actually, yeah, and indeed, I was just thinking productivity, but actually collaborative performance is, as when you speak of it, is actually sounds very different. But what then you're saying is that when people went remote, collaborative performance goes down, especially amongst cross-functional teams. Is that fair to say?
Correct. Yes.
So then, what argument do people have then for going remote if collaborative performance goes down?
So nobody has really done the research and study. That's why we're putting this research project together. So the goal with 10 to 20 companies, we anticipate that we'll probably end up with a data set of anywhere in between 20 and 50,000 people. And so we want to make sure that we see that. And we also want to show that there's examples that the remote can work, because we will find groups and teams where it does.
So of course, we have
And
hundreds of examples of remote teams rocking, right? Like
correct,
big
correct,
companies. Yeah.
correct. And then just yesterday, I was reading an article about 3M making their decision to basically go fully remote, because they say we can draw on a much broader talent pool. And so if you look at it, and one of the communications companies that I spent time with pre-COVID, they had, through different circumstances, in already 2010, 2012, basically put big screens on everybody's desk with web conferencing, and had pushed people into the remote world right away. And they were also had a phenomena that 50% of their people reported to people that were not based at the same location as they were.
Mm-hmm.
So they had remote work and teleconferencing in their blood and in their DNA way before COVID started. And I'm convinced that COVID didn't really have an impact on them. I'd love to get data from them to show that, because I'm trying to find different examples. Like I found an organization that has they're waiting for a new building. The building was delayed, and as a result, they have a lot less office space available than they will have. And they've started doing what I call structured hybrid, which says pick certain teams and they will all come in on designated days. And as a result of that, I want them in the study also, because I want to show that makes a difference than having people just randomly come in.
So that's what you mean by structured hybrid. So we have that increase in collaborative performance when you get the right people in the room together at the same time, but it has to be the right people. But I can imagine that's going to be very difficult for organizations, because if you want to give everybody the freedom to choose when and where they're most productive, but you still want that 35% increase, you're going to have to mandate certain people to come back at certain times. Otherwise, you just have it's the herding
Correct.
cats. You've just got cats
Correct.
everywhere.
So a lot of organizations have actually gone that way, and they've said we designate one day where everybody from the team has to be in. So the department or the team or whatever it is, right? Which is a step in the right direction, right? Because it brings them together. But as I had a friend who was a manager of a finance group at a big organization, and he said, yeah, but it only makes sense for my team to come in because we've done a good job, in his opinion, working remotely, only if this other department is in at the same time. And so this is actually the challenge where we can show that very easily with the data, that if team A comes in on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, then we can say, well, then to really maximize the opportunity, then team G and P and H should also come in on that day, because they used to have strong relationships and they lost a lot of that relationship, and having them on premises at the same days to do that. And if you want to, there's some interesting discussions that we're having. And one is, who's at the office at the same time you are? And we have a partnership with Smart and Spaces, which is a booking platform, and they know who's in the office, right? And if we then, from the system, could add, we know you and we know your personal network, we could push that into their system, and then you can actually identify who from your personal network is in the office on the same day. And then comes the question is, do you tell them that? So you can actually see who's in the office of your core communicators, right? Of the people that you work with. And, I've seen too many parents that track their kids' phones. You can do that in an office environment. And I've heard of some organizations that have actually gone to the point where you can do an opt-in. So you can see whether or not I'm in the office, and you can actually see where I am. So that's an opt-in layer is from a privacy perspective, because you can't create stalking environments. But to be able to see, because with activity-based workspace, you don't know where people are going to sit. But it is interesting for you to know who's in the building. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Wi-Fi tracking, that you can see where they are. Just the fact that they're in the building, then you can ping them. Where are you? Let's grab a coffee, or let's meet. I want to discuss this with you.
So it sounds really good, but is it realistic? I mean, this is what I keep asking also leaders and organizations. They're saying like we really want everybody back 3, 4 days a week, or even all
Well,
days per week. But like
so
toothpaste is out of the tube, right? Can we
that
get it back in?
this is one of the things that I'm challenging them with. And what they're trying to do with the 3 or 4 days a week is to try to find that magical tipping point where there's enough of inertia that people see enough of the people that they need to work with, right? If they're there more than 50% of the time, then there's a higher chance than if they just come in randomly. My comment is the mandate is going to have impact on engagement, which is also having impact on mental health. And we've got to recognize that. And there are a few people in these large organizations that actually see the numbers in terms of what's happening to mental health claims. And I'm not sure anybody's ready to make that public yet, right? And because if that's an issue, then, my comment was, before COVID, there were a whole lot of people just going through the motions of going to the office. Engagement was not beautiful before COVID, right? And if
No, the
anything, the
numbers, the
data,
statistics were all low. It was
they
like,
were all low.
yeah.
So there were a whole bunch of people that were on a really fine line of, are they depressed or not? And COVID is now made it worse. So we're doing a self-reported assessment with a partner also that looks at well-being. And the first data that we're seeing out of that is well-being is lower than it was pre-COVID. And so now if you end up mandating going back to the office, there's going to be attrition. So people are going to start looking for it. And it's interesting, in Toronto, there's an area which is all young people, millennials that live there. It's all condos, and it's very short distance. And one of the things that we want to do in the study is actually look at correlation between attending the office and distance from where you live. And, then you can start thinking, the theory is, if they're going to have the massive attrition, how long is it going to take the HR department to start looking at postal codes and hiring based on proximity, which means we would actually go to Moreno's idea of the 15-minute city. That's a Colombian sociologist who's looked and written about that we should all work, play, shop within 15 minutes of where we live, which is better for the environment. It's better for all sorts of different reasons, right? So I think this area of Toronto that is so close to the financial core is all those millennials will see in the next 5 to 7 years is going to see a massive career opportunity because this middle tier doesn't want to come in. They're going to look for something else or they're going to quit. And it's going to create a vacuum where all these millennials are going to jump into mid-level positions.
So is that what you're seeing in the data? Is that it's the mid-level managers that
No,
are the ones? Okay.
we
Oh,
don't.
can you
So
see in the
this
data
study,
actually?
this data is what we're looking for in the research. And one of the tags that we look for is, are they individual contributors, supervisory, or executive? And then you can look at that supervisory and executive level to see that. And we don't know if the companies are actually going to share the postal codes of people, because then we can start looking at it. I think it's a significant piece of information that you need to look at and you need to understand about your people. And I've talked to some organizations that have already done postal code studies to see. And I don't know if they're correlating that with badging data or login data, because those are typically the ways to get a handle on whether or not the people are in the office.
Right. And before we started talking, you had mentioned that there were a number of mid-level managers that had moved out into the suburbs away from the city during the pandemic. And now, of course, indeed, what we're talking about, there's a large commute if coming back to the office, and people don't want to do that. I mean, especially
Yeah.
because if you're set up at home, you've got a nice workspace, right? Maybe your workspace at home is better than what you could get at the office. So there'd be very little incentive to come in
Well,
except
this
for the
is
collaborative performance.
Yeah, and Leesman out of the UK did a number of studies, or they've published a series of results of what they had the Leesman Index, which was looking at how people felt about the office space, and they did a home LMI, which is Leesman Index, and what they found is that the older people with established networks also had better work environments at home. So if you have a manager level that bought a nice house in a suburb, typically they have a dedicated workspace. Whereas the younger people that were one day at the kitchen table, one day at the dining room table, one day in the bedroom, they're the ones that were more irritated by the environment. So they have more interest in going back. And I think there's a lot of press going to career opportunities being visible. It's going to impact your future. And for the younger people, that's important. For the older people, less so. They're looking at how many more years do I have until I retire?
Yeah, and also just comfort, right? Like as we get older, we're just, like I would take a lot for me to go back to an office. I have a very comfortable office here at home. I've got my own social life, like it would really take a lot for me to have to travel a couple hours a day for commuting and, going into a noisy environment where I might thrive less. So yeah, there's a,
Yeah, so my teaching at University of Toronto, for me to get to the campus takes me an hour. I have to plan an hour and a half. And for me, going back into the classroom, 100%, I would do the commute because the experience for me and for the students is 100 times better.
right,
And
right.
I would never go back to the remote teaching. I think it's bad for the students. It's bad for the profs from that perspective. And it's what I teach is interactive too. So if you're just consuming what the prof says, is a different environment than the courses that I teach.
Well, sure. And if you're just consuming what somebody says, you can watch a video. Like, why be there live together? You could just
Correct.
pre-record. So indeed,
I've
there is something more about the classroom experience. It's like concerts, right? I could watch a Depeche Mode concert on the internet on YouTube. It's different when you're there in the stadium, right? You're still, so it's a different experience. And I think that's the same when you're in a classroom. There's a group vibe going on that's important. But I wanted, oh, go ahead.
back just to summarize a little bit there. For the organizations, it's really three aspects that they need to look at. One is, how do we recapture the collaboration? And some of them are saying, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, let's mandate everybody back to the office. The second one is, how much space do we really need? And what should that space look like? So how should it be designed? And that amount of space that you need is a function of how well can you actually load balance your facility. So, which is part of the advantage of a structured hybrid would bring. So because you start picking certain teams and designate certain days, you can bring them on certain days, you can balance your load on your facility from that perspective, which has huge impact on number of square meters that you need to lease from that perspective. And the third one is, and I'm seeing it coming up increasingly, is to recognize the impact on the environment result, or the result on the environment from an engagement perspective and mental health. And that's going to have impact on attrition and the general productivity of people too. So those are really the three things that the organizations need to pay attention to. And in order to do so, you really need to understand the dynamics of how people are working with each other and what's happening from that perspective, and what kind of changes are there, and how do you make them better. And this is where I think, you know, what collaboration superpowers also brings to the table is, how do you help the teams that are remote and distributed become more effective and become better? And I'd love to help the organizations understand that and measure them over time, because this is where the impact is going to have the most impact on the profitability of the organization.
You're reminding me of the interview that I did recently in January with an astronaut. And what he said as astronauts is that they train to have the right information at the right place at the right time. And that is what makes a mission, an astronaut mission, successful, is that they train the communications for that delay. They train so that they know each other well enough that they can see in a blink of an eye without needing to verbally communicate what the other person needs and what they're thinking. And the same is sort of true, you know, to a lesser extent with hybrid teams. But that's what we want to do, is deliberate collaboration. We want to train as a team to have the right information at the right place at the right time, so that we can align towards a goal together. And so that's sort of what we're working for. But what I'm worried about is this 35% drop in collaboration when we go remote. And so
You have to acknowledge what you've got before you go remote. And these were organizations where we measured this. These were organizations where everybody was in the office every day. And if you had an organization which was much more networked from a distance perspective before COVID, it would have less impact. So it's really these organizations that had massive floors, thousands of people in a building that were all working together, they lost the most. The other organization where I said they've been, since 2012, been pushing screens on everybody's desk. A bunch of people came in every day, but a bunch of people only came in when they had very specific meetings. So you can't ignore the past. And I always have a slide that I use in presentations, which was an individual standing with one foot in a pot of boiling water and the other in a block of ice. And on average, they are not okay. And you've got to acknowledge that in an organization, you can't manage or come up with a solution based on the average, because the average could be not suitable for anybody. So you've got to acknowledge that different departments, different impacts. And this is where, you know, we believe that from a privacy perspective is, we say minimum group size 10, so that you protect the individual from that perspective. Other groups get labeled at 30 or 50, whatever it is. It doesn't matter. But you can start looking at what happens to these people and what's the impact of what you're doing on those people. I was working for a company which is now part of Siemens during the Gulf crisis, and the CEO put a travel ban in place. And that's where I started. This is early 90s. And this is where I found PictureTel and started doing my first desktop video conferencing. And bandwidth was awful. Oftentimes the bandwidth was so bad that we would share the document on PictureTel and we would do a voice conference overlay, so we could talk to each other and look at the same picture at the same time. So I've been responsible for global product launches and global accounts. This is from after business school. So I've been remote all my life because the people that I'm working with were everywhere. But in the beginning, it was, I had my email on my desk, a phone on my desk because cell phones weren't there yet, and my seat on a plane. And so I'm a big believer that a lot can be done remotely, and you need to pick. I've always said a lot of times people don't pick the right channel to communicate the message that they need to. A very difficult question. It's much easier at 5 to 5 to write the question, hit this, put the question mark in there and hit the send button and log off, because you want to avoid the discussion because it's painful. And this is where, irrespective of what telecommunications, people still need to make decisions in terms of how they communicate. Right. And so I'm a
Yeah.
big believer in the remote, and we have to do that. Right. And I'm all there to, let's make hybrid work first. Let's not mandate stuff, because you're going to lose too much on engagement and well-being. You need to give them the tools and provide the proper environment, and to a certain extent, engineer the environment so that the interactions take place.
Well, and so what you're saying there, though, is we don't want to mandate people to come back to the office randomly, but we do want to mandate it deliberately, right? Because if you're going to do structured hybrid, you have to get a certain percentage of certain groups back at the office, which means you're mandating specific groups of people back together. So you want to do structured mandates is really what you want to do.
Right. And you need to
Although
manage your office.
I'm having an allergic reaction to any mandate, I think. But
Well, you give them some flexibility. If you're saying 2 or 3 days, then you say there's one day that's designated and mandated, right? And then the other ones, other people pick. And my comment is, everybody used to go to the office on Monday and on Friday, and now they get allergic that they can't stay at home on Mondays and Fridays. If you get one of the two, bonus. There's still too many people out there in the world that think that the Monday Friday was, they were going to a 4-day work week from the beginning.
right. Well, in the beginning, in 2017, even the term work from home didn't mean work and communicate with your colleagues from home. It meant go home so that you could be productive and keep your head down and just do your
Yeah.
own thing for the day. Right. You weren't like interacting with colleagues. You were leaving so you didn't have to have those meetings. So,
Or you didn't want the interruptions. When I was in an
right.
office working for a big company, my door was always open, and I told people, I said, you have a question, you come in, you don't need to make an appointment. And they did. And from time to time I would say, time out tomorrow. I'm working from home because I need to have my head down uninterrupted to get something done.
Yeah.
Right. But the idea of that you have focus days and collaborative days is also an illusion. If you get to a certain level in an organization, you can't say, I'm going to just collaborate today, or I'm just going to focus today. That doesn't work either.
All right.
So there's still a lot of learning that needs to be done by a lot of people.
Indeed. And I think the question really is like, how do we create a structured hybrid environment that gives everybody the flexibility and freedom that we all so value and want, and keep the collaborative relationships of the organization strong. So there, I think that's where the tension lies, right? There's the flexibility side and then the collaborative performance side, and those things have to be merged together, I think, in a more deliberate way.
Yeah, in the last few weeks, you've probably seen some of these articles too, that there's now companies talking about that in their performance review, they're going to put a printout on the table of office presence. So based on badging or login, they're going to know. And when you get to the performance review, they're going to look at it and see, well, let's see how much you came in. And I think it's too much focus on the individual. It's how do we make the collective organization better? That's what I've been fighting for from the beginning.
Right, right. It feels like it's like the right intention with the wrong metric
Yeah.
somehow. It's you're measuring the wrong thing. But if but okay, but that's a whole other we could go on and on about that. And I think you and I have discovered we could talk endlessly about these things, especially when there's
Yes.
data involved, right? We can go on. Okay, but we're nearing the end of the conversation. I still have a couple more questions. Um, you mentioned, but I don't think here's what I wanted to ask. The last time we spoke, we talked about time spent looking for information. searching for information, and that was something that you could measure as part of the
So,
collaborative performance. What have we seen since then?
so this is the theoretical piece, and it's still in concept phase. We're not doing it in any organizations. And how people make a decision is involves risk. If you have somebody who does research, gets information, and makes a decision, I'm much more comfortable with it than if somebody looks at it and say, based on my gut feel or the seat of my pants, I'm making this decision, right? And so I always say that the objective of collaboration is to leverage the collective experience, expertise, and knowledge of the organization to its maximum benefit. So how do we prevent reinvention of the wheel? And there's organizations that the problem comes up again and again, and nobody knows that somebody's already solved it. So
Right.
this is what you want to do is you want to create a culture. And this is always one of the challenges is I may have a bunch of trivial information that I've gathered in my head and what I consider trivial, but it may be critical for a decision that you're making. You don't know to ask me, and I don't know to tell you because you don't know that I know that information. So how do you create a culture, which is a culture of questioning and valuing other people's expertise? So the amount of search that gets done, and if you have a Microsoft SharePoint or a big document repository of any kind, is how many people hit that repository looking for stuff is a great indicator, right? In terms of collaboration and how much information goes from one department to another department to the other side of the world from that perspective. So this is much more of a philosophical. It's still there. I talked about it six years ago with you, but it's still philosophical, still there. But I think this understanding collaboration journey is one that's going to take a long time, and it's how you grow with it. And we've seen that too. Is we've shown some certain things, and then the client actually said, "Oh, but then we should track this." Which for me was the light went on in their head, and they then see the value of it going forward.
Right.
And that's ultimately where you go. And when you learn to work with what you have, you can go one step further. The immediate thing right now is how do we get people back into the office because intuitively they believe that this is what we need to do to get them to collaborate with each other. The other one is the cost associated with how much office space do we need? And there's a whole bunch of organizations that are confronted with, well, okay, so we had 10 floors now. Do we need 7? Do we need 6? And how do we manage those 6? Because you want to get back to how do we maximize the utilization of our assets also, right? So
Sure. And you want
this
to
is,
design your spaces for maximum collaboration because the use of the office is going to be different now. People are coming in for different reasons.
and coming in and being in a space of 100, being one of 7 people on there during the floor is during the day is demoralizing too.
For
Right?
sure.
If you come in and it's like, I make the effort to come in and there's nobody else there, what's up with that? Right? We can't have those type of environments either.
Or if you just
So
spend all day on video calls in the office, it's like I would have rather been at home. At least I was comfortable.
correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So
But some people, I knew this from before COVID. Some people tried working from home and they were horrible at it. And they went crazy because there were too many distractions. They didn't have the discipline. They didn't shut out all the other stuff. And they needed to go into an office and sit down. And that's where I think I don't want to prescribe everything to everybody because you're going to drive people crazy.
yeah.
You need to give them a choice and a flexibility.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, my husband is one of those people who hates working from home. So we are always in this tension, of, well, it's not that I'm pro remote, I'm pro freedom. But so but I'm always reminded of other people's desires to work in different places, just because I see it all the time at home. So
Yeah, and
indeed,
I'm
that's
not saying prescribe it. Put some guardrails on it and some guidance, and still give people some flexibility. I think
yeah,
there's
there's
great
no, it doesn't have
opportunity
to
to
be
do
all or
lots.
nothing.
Correct.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
indeed. It's a lot of gray here but I like where you're coming from because you're coming from the perspective of data. You can measure this, you can measure
Yeah.
it before things happen, you can measure things after things happen. So you don't indeed have to go on gut feel or surveys or anecdotal. you can actually see collaboration in the numbers. And maybe it's not perfect, but the way we're doing it now isn't perfect. It's less perfect now.
Yeah, so it's interesting with this partner, we're the Mind Suite, we're actually doing an assessment, and the hope is that of the 10 to 20 companies that come into the research piece that give us the real data, that we can also get them to do the assessment. And the idea, the hope would be that we can actually do the de-identification of it with the same key. So we could tie the self-reported data to the actual behavioral data. That would be fascinating. I've got my fingers crossed on that, because then you can see how people feel about it and see how they really behave and make the personas much more significant.
Yeah, indeed. Oh yeah, that would be fascinating. Well, my fingers are crossed for you as well. So
Well,
for
hopefully I
my
can come after it's done. Hopefully we can come back and do another podcast and I can tell you
heck
about
yeah, part three. I would love to. I'd
it.
love to hear about it. So just for the last question, something very easy, of course, which is if people want to find you online, where's the best place to connect with you?
So our website is collabogence.com and my email address is peter@collabogence.com.
Well, that's easy enough, and we'll also put that in the show notes for easy access. Peter, thank you so much for being back on as a guest and for taking us through all that you've learned over the last 6 years. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. We'll talk to you soon.
All right, everybody, until next time, be powerful.